Delighted to come and chat to you today. So Casca asked me to speak about, I suppose it was a kind of audio installation work rather than a podcast, I suppose, that I created for, it was called A Fragile Correspondence. It was an architecture exhibition. I'm not an architect, but I was a local collaborator. So I'll share more of the details in a moment. But the piece was really about being in correspondence with the landscape where I live. So that is, I think I've got a slide to show you, Abriachan and Inverness. So this is a story where it was trying to find a way really to tell the story of community-owned Abriachan Forest. And the idea was to try and invite reflection on the possibilities of collective land stewardship or community ownership, and the possibilities for ecological and social and cultural renewal. So I'll tell you a bit about how I went about it, if that's useful. There's a map to orient you here, and this is the invitation to the forest. So yeah, this is a story of what can be restored, both in terms of biodiversity and community, really, through acts of care, connection, and really taking agency in a place. I've got a background in ethnology, which is a form of cultural anthropology, I suppose, and it's a discipline that has much in common with human ecology, both interested very much in that relationship or interrelationship, I suppose, between people and places. And both of these disciplines share an emphasis, I suppose, on active engagement and change making, informed by scholarship, I suppose, and integrating theory and practice. Yeah, Casca and I actually met in Ullapool on a course run by Centre for Human Ecology, an online degrowth course with a residential component. So that was with the Centre for Human Ecology and a collective called Enough. And I think I've actually got a slide with some quotes from that day. And the course is different each year, but in my contributions, coming from a kind of ethnology background, is to try and draw upon what we can learn from the so-called the carrying stream of culture in our own local places. You know, this idea of what has come before, cultural heritage, history, folklore, imagination, forms of resistance, local resistance, and framing what we have here in Scotland, or particularly in the Highlands, as part of global pluriverse, if you like, of local resistance to the monoculture of global capitalism. That's the kind of thrust of the course, Casca, isn't it? This story, the way that I went about this was kind of with all of that framing in mind, and trying to tell a story that was an example. I suppose it's the same idea that behind the 1,000 Stories podcast is finding these stories of renewal and resistance and possibility. So my creative practice then is informed by all of this, and I thought it might be useful. It's an image to try and represent the various strands of what I get up to, and right in the heart there is really the center of my practice, this idea of dig where you stand. I'm sure you've come across this idea in your work and practice, but I think it's really inspiring and generative. It has an interesting history. It's translated from the original Swedish, and originally promoted the idea of public participation and research in local history, in particular labour history, but has been adopted by kind of international adult education movement, public history movement, and has been evoked in the environmental movement and land reform movement as a kind of vital step towards consciousness raising and just getting to know your own place in order to be able to imagine possible futures. And I love this idea because there's kind of solidarity at work here too, you know, understanding more about our own local places deepens empathy with others seeking forms of injustice, environmental justice or otherwise, throughout the world. So it's a really lovely idea to kind of hook what we're trying to do. Yes, Alistair McIntosh writes about this idea. He writes, I think this is the opening paragraph perhaps of his book Soil and Soul, which I'm sure is familiar to you all. If any of us dig deep enough where we stand, we will find ourselves connected to all other parts of the world, which is beautiful. And I've written an essay or multiple various things and bits and bobs with a friend and long-term collaborator of mine, Renich Sandilands, and maybe share her work with you later. And we've written about our ideas in relation to this. So it's the idea that digging where we stand is an invitation to take agency in our own place, to become part of the ongoing and unfolding story. And it is also to enter into an ethical and reciprocal relationship with the land, its past, its people, and their stories. So this digging where we stand is really a kind of key part of that creative process, kind of seeking to find connections that cut across time, kind of drawing on our past to be able to imagine, hopefully, more hopeful futures, I suppose. And in this endeavour, fieldwork is a fantastic tool to help us dig where we stand. Obviously, it's a methodology in many kind of humanities pursuits, but in the most general sense, this is the process or act of recording information from people with kind of conversation at its heart. And from my background, there's a long tradition of fieldwork and folklore collecting in Scotland. I suppose it goes back really to kind of early 18th century and changed character as technology advanced. And in the 20th century, it was really revolutionized by sound recording. And with the digital media of our time, there are so many possibilities. And I suppose that's really what Casca is trying to inspire with this project. And I've just highlighted on the screen here, it's an online archive resource that I work with called Toper and Dúilchais in Gaelic, Well of Heritage, or the Kist o' Riches in Scots. If you haven't had a wee dig around here, it's absolutely fantastic. In terms of fieldwork in a Scottish context as well, this is an iconic image of fieldworker Hamish Henderson, pictured here with the traveller Alex Stewart, in Sutherland, a traveller storyteller from the 1950s. And this, what they were talking about in this image, you can find on the archive, and there's just so many stories recorded in there. So if you haven't been in there, it's a treasure trove. If anything, that you pick up from this talk for me is to have a wee look in there. And I'm sure many of you have had a go at fieldwork in some form or other. But I just thought I'd share some reflections from my background. I mean, I suppose in a way it's both really easy and infinitely complex, and people can spend a lifetime honing their skills, and I think I'd be included in that. And I'd say the kind of most experienced field workers that I've had the pleasure to learn from have a real kind of humility about them. And this is an example from an American ethnologist, Henry Glassy, who you might have come across. And he says, "Fieldwork is a form of enrichment that requires as much expertise as any delicate craft." He also writes, "Almost everybody is really interesting, and all I have to do is put myself in the way of other people, and they'll bump into me and teach me," which is, I think, a lovely way to think about it. So that's kind of my background: folklore, fieldwork, ethnology, radical human ecology. So the exhibition I mentioned, I'll speak about it more in detail now, was commissioned by the Scotland and Venice partnership for the Venice Biennale. It was co-curated by the Architecture Fringe, and they run an amazing open platform architecture festival and curate work, and two architect collectives called Ism and /Other, and so they were bringing lots of different perspectives in. And the exhibition itself responds to this theme of the laboratory of the future. And the exhibition kind of focused on 3 locations in Scotland: Highland, Island, and Lowland. And the idea was that in bringing forward the diversity of cultures or languages in particular that have shaped the landscapes of Scotland, they were trying to explore alternative or new approaches to the challenges of the climate emergency, essentially, and kind of drawing on past echoes and this kind of frame of extraction. So where we were in Inverness, the exhibition kind of honed in on the forest landscapes north and south of the iconic Loch Ness, I suppose, not perhaps known for its forests, but and how that land is managed and stewarded, because it's a real mosaic of ownership patterns. And one of the questions was, how can we create a more reciprocal connection with the land? In responding to this, like, the most obvious story from digging where I stand is Abriachan Forest Trust. So I'm not sure if you have come across this place before, but it's a community-owned forest, and this year celebrates 25 years of community ownership. So it was actually the first community buyout of a forest area in Scotland. They obviously followed in the footsteps of the Assynt Crofters up in Northwest Sutherland before them, and the Isle of Egg, which has kind of come to be the most famous story perhaps of community ownership. And they were pioneering a new model of land holding beyond this kind of capitalist logic of private property. And of course, there are now many examples of community land ownership in Scotland, but oh yeah, I've got some photos for you there. On the left, that's the Forest classroom. In the middle is a hut that was actually built as part of the architecture Fringe Festival I mentioned earlier, a kind of event exploring the possibilities of hutting and forests and what that means. And the forest, around the forest are dotted these beautiful birds, which are kind of a symbol of the renewal of biodiversity and community. There are so many examples of community land ownership now. There've been these conferences, and there's a beautiful quote here from Jim Hunter, where he says, community land will become a story of the 21st century, the unleashing of a new sense of confidence, energy, and opportunity. So this includes islands, rural estates, forestry and woodland. In urban contexts, it's kind of allotments or urban spaces. But in some of the studies that have been done, community forestry initiatives in particular are significant, not just for contesting patterns of land tenure, but in terms of their potential for biodiversity restoration. And I think that's the kind of one of the key parts of the story. After 25 years of, careful stewardship, this is the story I was trying to tell. Abriachan Forest has been transformed largely from a kind of Sitka spruce, lodgepole pine plantation that was obviously so prevalent following the Second World War, and it's now a kind of diverse and regenerating woodland, home to all sorts of creatures, woodland birds, butterflies, dragonflies, frogs, loads of frogs, mammals, squirrels, otters, pine martens. It's lovely. And there's an outdoor nursery there and a forest school. So it's just amazing to see what can be done, that kind of story of community renewal. And this is a quote from an accompanying essay for the audio piece. And I think it's really important just understanding the origins of the community land movement in Scotland, even, that it has radical roots in the Highland or the Gaeltacht, the Gaelic speaking areas of the Highlands and Islands. It's no coincidence perhaps that contemporary ideas on ecological land stewardship emerge from a language and culture with strong environmental awareness, long-standing understandings about the interrelationship between land, language and people, and a worldview in which people belong to places rather than places belonging to people, which I think is a really powerful idea and kind of inspired what I was trying to do. So using this opportunity then to dig where I stand, do some field work, get to know my neighbours, I decided to, as an offering to the exhibition, to create an audio installation piece, and it attempts to tell this story through the memories and voices of the people who were part of the ongoing story of this place. It was really important that it wasn't my voice, that it was told through their voices, their memories, their stories. And actually I spent that's the kind of nub of the story on the screen there, but it actually took me so long to get to the heart of the narrative that I was trying to tell, because there's so much going on and so much history and so much, and it was actually quite difficult. So it's a story of renewal and this idea of what can be restored. So I reached out to my neighbours and people who I knew had been real movers and shakers in the early days of the community buyout. And some preferred to be in the background, which is absolutely fine. Some are willing to talk to me. And two of the participants were actually my actual neighbours. So that was just really fantastic to be able to do that. And, as well, given that this exhibition was going to be in a very urban context in Venice, that people would get a sense of being in the woods. So I did the interviews mostly on site in the forest, or if I couldn't manage that, in people's gardens, but it's quite a rural place. So, there was birds and sounds of the outdoors everywhere. And partly the reason behind this was to give some consistency in terms of the recording. So for the listener, there weren't some kind of dead spaces and then outdoor spaces. And the recordings took place in kind of March, April time. So the birds were extremely noisy. But that kind of, I turned that into a feature of the piece. also had to contend with the noise of rescue helicopters. Didn't realise how many rescue helicopters were going up and down Loch Ness, and cars, and just all the kind of problems that you encounter doing outdoor recording. I was part inspired by an album I had written a wee review for called Breathing Space. By a friend, musician, producer, and sound engineer, Barry Reid. I also asked him for lots of advice. So this is a kind of collection of original melodies mixed with sound recordings of the landscape to kind of build up beautiful soundscapes. And while I'd done many interviews before with people, and I'd never quite ventured into the world of recording the natural environment and the bird song. So that was quite interesting. There were different challenges there with recording these sounds. So the problem that I was having was, recording the wind in the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the birds was this kind of unwanted buzz in the background. I think it's called audio gain hiss, which is a common problem. And Barry, of course, he uses top of the range recording equipment, which I didn't have access to. So I made a compromise, and this is what I use. I'm not sure what you recommend, but a trusty Zoom, which I've used for years, and then a plug-in shotgun mic. Oh yeah. So yeah, Zooms are great, but I really relied on not as fancy microphones in the past, and the difference it made using one of these shotgun condenser mics was amazing. So really very thankful to a friend and colleague, another ethnologist, Steve Byrne, really interesting guy. So I borrowed that from him, which enabled me to get over these hurdles. Obviously I had some hiccups. I ran out of battery twice. I forgot to press record. Absolutely embarrassing. Like a wonderful neighbor of mine, Hilda Hessling, who's got the most beautiful voice and so articulate and beautiful, and I had forgotten to press record. I was mortified, and then you can never recreate the same conversation twice, but it's still people are very understanding. And actually, one of my top tips for doing fieldwork outside is don't ever record people wearing raincoats, or these down jackets you get with the kind of rustly. Oh my goodness, I lost so much great material because of even the tiniest movement, and then the audio material isn't usable. So yeah, in terms of how I went about it, I then listened back to each interview. I suppose each interview was about an hour long. I'd aimed for maybe a bit less because people get tired, but time rolled on, and I could have talked to them for hours, honestly, just so interesting. So I then listened back to each interview, time-stamped it all on a spreadsheet, and kind of trying to divide it into themes and clips. And this is massively time-consuming. And the software I used I borrowed Logic Pro, but to be honest, I relied in the early days on Audacity, which is just open source audio editing software, which is good enough. But in the end, because of the multi-tracks, I needed something to pull it all together because there were multiple tracks involved. So once I had, completed the process of kind of tracking it all, I split each interview into the clips and numbered them, so then I could sort of weave them together and create the narrative of the piece. And it was difficult because you have to keep the kind of the volume of the voices consistent and try and get a balance of voices. And then when I had all of the clips of the voices in the right order, each of those clips had the kind of background bird sound and forest noise, but I also added an additional kind of ambient noise recorded of sounds of the forest to try and make it a bit more seamless and stitch it together. This is just a wee clip.
Well, just listen to the bird song here, as I was saying when I came here first, you wouldn't hear a thing.
This kind of became, it's my favourite fragment, and became the kind of main narrative, this idea of the return of the birds. You'll hear also that there's a beautiful, delicate solo fiddle in the background, and that is Highland-based musician Lauren McCall. She just has a magic touch on the fiddle. So I asked her, and she very graciously allowed me to use two of her tracks from an album called Landskeen. And it's quite significant, actually, choosing this material because she'd actually commissioned me to write an accompanying essay to this album a few years ago, and it was recorded by the same Barry Reid who I mentioned earlier with the Breathing Space album, and it was recorded in our local hall in Abriachan Village Hall, which is known for its very fine acoustics. It's kind of been updated in recent years, but kind of crinkly tin roof, wooden paneling, and just really beautiful kind of container for Highland fiddle, I suppose. So I thought it was the perfect fit to give some lift and melody to the voices. And just speaking personally, I love this kind of music. It's just so kind of in amongst all the chatter and noise, and just to have that unadulterated, pure fiddle is just absolutely divine. And I kind of love the theme of it as well, landskein. It's a word that means, I've got a definition here, the weaving and braiding of horizon lines, often seen most clearly on a hazy day in hill country. You know, that beautiful kind of, all the hills going off into the distance. And certainly from where we are up high in the hills in Abriachan, like landskeins are something you see. And I also think it kind of suggests a kind of thread or yarn in which the lifelines of landscape, people and stories are all kind of richly intertwined. So yeah, that was the music. I'm going to speak a little bit about some challenges and kind of considerations, practical, ethical, political, legal. That sounds heavy, doesn't it? But really important to talk about. So in the beginning, initially, I had really hoped to record some of the voices of the children at the Forest Nursery, because that's such a hopeful, beautiful thing, you know, that as a part of the woodland there, that these kids are growing up with a community owned woodland that is their own place, and they have that beautiful relationship with the landscape. But it was an ethical maze in terms of consent and permissions, and just too difficult to coordinate in the time frame I had. So I spoke with the forest school leader and tried to convey that story in other ways. Yeah, I suppose I've taught the practicalities of fieldwork in a kind of university setting, and also in the context of creative projects. And there are all of these wee things to think about, which I'm sure you're very much aware of in your own work and practice. But it's really important and good practice to protect, you know, both yourself and the people participating in your project, and being very clear about the kind of legal basis for their participation, their consent. And I suppose a simple and easy way to do this is just in the form of this is how I do it. I'm sure you have different ways. A kind of participation information sheet, which kind of outlines the basics of what your project is about, who you are, the organization you represent, the kind of nature of the project, and how the recordings will be used, and how their voices. Essentially, it's such a personal, intimate thing to record people's voices. And in many ways, the people recorded in the 1950s would have no idea that I would listen to them on my iPhone while I was in the bath. You know, I'm joking, but you know, like, you know, it's just kind of really important to look after people. But I was referring to Toper and Dulcish, by the way, that I mentioned earlier. It's amazing that at your fingertips you can listen to these conversations that took place so long ago. And in today's world, there are other responsibilities in terms of privacy laws and GDPR and all the rest of it. So it's quite simple. It sounds so bureaucratic, but just keeping a written record of when and how individuals consented to take part in your project, you know, just being responsible and accountable. But the problem is, you know, looking ahead, you might not know exactly what you want to do with the material. There's all manner of ways in which the speech that is recorded can be used, but it's just good practice to have preparations in place. It's like, I might do this and I'll definitely edit your voice, and you know, but then again, also before releasing it to the public, made sure that they were all absolutely happy with the ways in which I had edited their voices and tried to stitch it together. And my neighbour Christine was amazing, because she was sort of like, I don't think you quite get that point because you cut that bit out. And then I went back to her and re-recorded it to make sure that she was happy with how I was telling that story. Yeah, the ultimate aim is just to look after people, both yourself and the people you're working with.